The first one I picked up was outside a little French village. The name, S gone now. They all blur together after a while, but I remember the mud. It was that thick, greasy mud that sucks at your boots, the kind that makes every step feel like you're dragging the whole earth with you. The fighting had moved on. The big guns were just a dull thump-thump-thumping miles away, and the air was still thick with the smell of cordite and wet earth and something else, something sour and sweet all at once that you never get used to, no matter how many times you smell it. We were moving through what was left of an orchard, just splintered stumps of trees, and the ground all churned up like a ploughed field from the shelling. And there he was, just a kid, really. Couldn't have been more than 18, 19. He was lying on his back, his uniform soaked dark, his face pale and surprisingly clean, like he was just sleeping under that grey sky. He was a Kraut anymore, not in that moment. He wasn't the enemy who'd been shooting at us an hour before. He was just a kid who'd been told to stand his ground and didn't live long enough to run. My buddy Mikey, a tough kid from Chicago, just grunted and kept walking. Move along, kid. He ain't gonna thank you for staring. But I couldn't. My feet felt rooted in that damned mud. I knelt down, my knees sinking into the cold wet, the whole time feeling like a target, like a sniper was drawing a bead on the back of my neck. My hands were trembling, not from fear exactly, but from something else, a kind of hollow feeling in my gut. I saw the two tags, one hanging from a cord around his neck, the other still tucked into his boot like they taught us. My fingers, clumsy in my wool gloves, fumbled for the one in his boot. The metal was cold, shockingly cold against my skin. I pulled it free and just sat there on my haunches, staring at it. It wasn't fancy, just a dull aluminum oval with a string of numbers and a name stamped into it. Gottfried something. I don't remember the number, not anymore, but I remember the name. Gottfried. I rolled that cold metal between my thumb and forefinger, feeling the sharp edges of the stamped letters, and the weight of it. It felt heavier than any piece of metal that size had a right to be. Was this a prize? A trophy to prove I was here, that I'd survived and he had? That seemed wrong, disgustingly wrong. Was it just a piece of information, something to hand to the lieutenant so the paperwork could get filed away in some warehouse back in Berlin? That felt too clean, too sterile for the reality of this boy lying in the mud. Or was it something else, something more? A receipt for a life, a tiny, insignificant token that was all that was left of a human being. I shoved it deep into my pocket, the cold metal feeling like a brand against my thigh, and I had to run to catch up with the others, my heart pounding for a whole different reason now. You never talked about it, not really. It was one of those things, like how you never said you were scared, you just were, but you saw how the other guys handled it. You developed your own little ritual, a private moment in the middle of all that public chaos. After a firefight, when the noise died down, and that eerie quiet settled over everything, broken only by the moans of the wounded, you'd see the men. Some guys, like old Sergeant Miller, a farmer from Iowa who had kids of his own back home, he'd find a relatively quiet spot, dig a small hole with his entrenching tool, drop the tag in, and say a few words under his breath. He never made a show of it, just a quick, solemn moment, like he was planting a seed for a tree that would never grow. Other guys, they'd collect them and hand them over to the co, all business, like they were turning in extra rations. They wanted nothing to do with the weight of them. But then there were the others. There was a fella in our company, Peterson, a loudmouth from Texas who was always talking about getting him some souvenirs. He had a string of them, German tags, sometimes even Italian ones, jangling from his pack like a bunch of tin cans on a honeymoon car. He'd boast about them, point to one and say, "That one was an SS boy, put up a real fight," and he'd laugh. The rest of us, we gave guys like Peterson a wide berth. There was a coldness there, a distance that felt more dangerous than any mortar round. We'd share cigarettes, share stories about girls back home, share our fear in the middle of the night in a foxhole, but we never shared that particular space with the Petersons. It was like they'd crossed a line we were all trying desperately not to even see. And at night, that's when the ghosts came. Not the scary kind from ghost stories, but worse. The real kind. Lying in my bunk in some bombed-out barn or shivering in a rain-filled foxhole, trying to ignore the chatter of machine guns in the distance, I'd sometimes take them out. I only ever had a few at a time. I couldn't carry many. I'd hold them in my palm, these little cold pieces of metal, and I'd try to picture the faces that went with them. Not the dead faces I'd seen, twisted and empty, but living faces. That first kid, Gottfried, did he have a girl waiting for him? Did he like to drink beer with his friends in some little gasthaus? Maybe he was a farmer's son, good with horses. Did he like to ski in the Alps? It sounds crazy, but you start thinking these things. You humanize them because the alternative is to go crazy in a different way, to become like Peterson. And then the thought would hit me, a physical blow to the chest. Someone, somewhere in Germany, was waiting for a letter from him. A mother was probably praying for his safety right that second. A father was hoping his boy was being brave, and they'd keep waiting, and the letter would never come. All that would come, if they were lucky, was a cold, official notification, and all because of a piece of metal I had in my hand. That's when the war stopped being about good guys and bad guys, about freedom and tyranny on those personal, star-filled nights. It just became a giant, stupid, tragic meat grinder, and we were all just caught in the gears. We were just boys on both sides, who'd been handed a rifle and told to solve the problems old men had created. Those tags blurred everything. They made the enemy a person, and that was somehow more frightening than any fanatical Nazi stormtrooper caricature they'd shown us in the newsreels. After the bulge, after we pushed through those frozen forests and saw things no man should ever see, I made a choice. The Ardennes was hell frozen over. The cold was a living thing, biting into your bones. We lost so many good men there, guys who'd been with me since basic, just frozen solid where they fell. The Germans suffered worse, I think. I remember coming across a group of them, a whole squad, caught in the open by our artillery. They were just frozen statues in pathetic, threadbare uniforms. I went through the motions, checking for the tags for the Graves registration guys, and my fingers were so numb I could barely feel the metal. And I looked at one of them, a guy with a thin, blonde mustache, ice crystals forming on his eyelashes, and I just couldn't do it anymore. The weight was too much. I'd been carrying these ghosts in my pocket for months, and my pockets felt full of lead. I carefully placed all the tags I had, except for one next to the bodies, where the GR team would find them. I decided, right then and there, that I was done collecting. It wasn't my job to be the keeper of the dead. My job was to try and keep the living alive, myself and the buddies next to me. Let the Graves registration teams, those quiet, solemn men who did a job I could never stomach, let them handle it. They were the clerks of the afterlife, and I was just a temporary visitor. But I kept that first one, Gottfried's tag. I didn't keep it as a trophy, God no. I kept it as a reminder of the cost. A reminder of that first time I saw the war not as a great adventure, but as a terrible, personal tragedy. That little oval of aluminum stayed in my pocket, right next to my own dog tags, for the rest of the war. It was a sharp, cold reminder every time I reached for a cigarette or a piece of gum. It was my anchor to a reality I didn't want to forget, even though I desperately wanted to forget everything else. I carried it all through the push into Germany, through the surreal chaos of towns surrendering without a fight, and others fighting for every brick. I carried it when we liberated the camps, and the horrors we saw there made the personal tragedy of one soldier seem small, but somehow, in a way, even more profound. The industrial scale of death there was beyond comprehension, but Gottfried was just one boy. He was a number I could hold in my hand. And when the war finally ended, when the shooting stopped, and the silence was the most beautiful and strangest sound I'd ever heard, I still had it. On the troopship coming home, standing at the rail and watching America come into view, the Statue of Liberty looking like a promise kept, I reached into my pocket and felt it there. I thought about throwing it into the ocean, giving it a burial at sea, laying the ghost to rest. But I didn't. I brought it home with me. It's in a small wooden box on my dresser, next to my own dog tags and a few fading photographs. My wife, God bless her, she knows not to ask. My grandson did once. He found the box and asked what it was. I just told him it was a reminder of a friend I lost a long time ago. It wasn't a lie, not really. In a way, he was a friend. He taught me the most important lesson of that whole damned war, the one they don't teach you in basic training. He taught me that on the other side of the rifle sight, there's always a person. And that's a weight you carry long after the guns fall silent. A small, cold metal weight with a name on it. A ghost from a war I never forgot, and a part of me I left behind in the mud of a French orchard. You know, they ask you about the war, and they want to know about the big stuff, the battles, the names on a map. But the war, the real war I remember, it wasn't in the headlines. It was in the small things. The weight of a canteen, the smell of damp wool and cordite, the sound of a man breathing when he's trying not to make a sound. And for me, it was in the cold, stamped metal of a dog tag. My war was different from the riflemen, the guys I shared a foxhole with. I was a medic. My weapon was a bandage roll. My battlefield was any patch of mud where a man fell. And my duty, when everything else was done, was to those tags. People think a medic's job is all about saving lives. And sure, that's the hope. That's the prayer you whisper when you're running through hell with a red cross on your arm that don't mean a thing to a sniper. But a big part of the job, the part that stays with you long after the morphine syrettes are empty, is about the ones you can't save. It's about making sure they don't just vanish. It's about the name. My first priority was never the tag. Never. It was always the pulse under your fingertips, the rasp of a breath, the gush of blood you had to stop with your hands. You de-scramble to a guy, your heart hammering in your ears louder than the artillery, and your hands would be going over him, looking for the wound, the whole time you're talking to him. You're all right, buddy, you're gonna be fine, just hold on. A lie you told so often you almost started to believe it yourself. The frantic search for the tag, that awful fumbling under a bloody shirt collar that only started when the breathing stopped. When your hands, slick with someone else's life, couldn't find a heartbeat no matter how hard you pressed. When there was nothing more my bandages or my morphine could do. That's when the real work began. The work for the soul, not the body. There was a sacredness to it, a ritual. First, you'd close his eyes. You had to. You couldn't leave him staring up at that sky, whether it was blue or choked with smoke. It was a final act of decency, a small piece of order in all that chaos. Your thumb would gently slide over his eyelids, and for a second it was just you and him, no war, no noise, just this quiet promise. Then, and only then, would I reach for the tags. They were always cold, a shock against the warmth of a body that was only just starting to let go. You pull the chain over his head, and the clink of the metal was such a small sound, but it echoed louder than any shell. That clink was the sound of a life being tallied, of a notification being written, of a family's world collapsing back home. You learned to read those tags like a language. Sure, there was the name, the serial number, that's what everyone thinks of. But for us, the first thing we looked for if the guy was still hanging on was the blood type. That was the most important letter in the world. A B, ARB, oh, it could mean the difference between a chance and no chance at all. Then there was the religion. C for Catholic, P for Protestant, H for Hebrew. That was for the chaplain, if one was around for the last rites. We tried to honor that. It was the least we could do. The tags were designed to be snapped in half. They had a notch in them, and you were supposed to press them against something hard and break them along that perforation. One half stayed with the body, buried with him or tucked into his pocket if we were wrapping him in a blanket for the grave's registration guys. The other half went to command, the paper trail that started the long, lonely journey to Mother's doorstep. It was a system, a brutal, efficient, heartbreaking system. But the system broke down all the time. The worst moments, the worst, were with the obliterated tags. A shell doesn't care about identification. It turns a man into something else. And sometimes, the only thing left of his tags was a twisted piece of metal, the letters scraped away into nothing. That's when your stomach would just drop. When a man would become another unknown soldier. A statistic. You'd search and search, your fingers digging through the muck, through things you don't want to remember, just hoping to find that one piece of metal that held his identity. And when you couldn't, it felt like the ultimate failure, like you'd let him disappear twice. Once from this world, and once from the memory of it. The weight of that, it's a heavy thing to carry, heavier than any pack. Carrying the message, that was the responsibility. You were the link. You were the last person to see him, to touch him, to know his name in the context of his own face. You had to get it right. I'd fumble for my notepad, my fingers often still sticky with blood, the pencil trembling in my grip. You'd write it down carefully, block letters, making sure the B didn't look like an 8, the C didn't look like a 5. That piece of paper was everything. It was the difference between a gold star in the window and a lifetime of wondering. We'd joke, me and the other medics, in that grim way you do, that we were glorified secretaries. But there was no glory in it, just a cold, hard comfort. You couldn't save the man, but you could save his name. You could ensure that his family would know. That he died for something somewhere, and that he was found. In the midst of all that senseless slaughter, that felt like one small piece of sense. One thread of humanity we could hold on to. At the end of a hellish day, when the firing had died down to sporadic cracks, and the moaning had been replaced by an eerie silence, that's when it would hit you. You'd find a quiet spot, if such a thing existed, maybe leaning against a shattered wall or sitting in the back of a truck, and you'd pull out that notepad. And you'd read the names. I'd whisper them. Just under my breath, a private roll call. Miller John, R. Garcia Carlos, E. O'Reilly Patrick, J. It was my way of honoring them, of acknowledging that they were here, that they mattered. It was my way of sending them off, since I couldn't give them a proper burial most of the time. The names became a mantra, a sad prayer against the darkness. There's one I never forgot. His name was David Miller. Kid from Iowa, his tag said. I found him during the push after the bulge. It was cold, the kind of cold that gets into your bones and stays there. The ground was frozen hard and the snow was stained pink in places. He couldn't have been more than 18, a boy. His face was still soft, no hard lines yet. He had a piece of shrapnel, it was bad. There was nothing I could do. I held his hand while he went, telling him that same old lie, "You're gonna be fine, son." But I think he knew. His eyes had that faraway look they get. When it was over and I'd closed his eyes, I took his tags. They were warm from his skin. I snapped them, the crack sounding final in the quiet woods. One half I tucked into his shirt. The other, I held it in my hand for the longest time. I looked at his name, David Miller. I wondered if his mother called him Davy. I pictured her in a warm kitchen somewhere, far from this frozen hell, probably worrying herself sick over a boy who would never come home. And in that moment I made a promise to him, to Davy. I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't let him be just a number. I would remember him. Not as a casualty, not as a statistic in some general's report, but as David Miller from Iowa. A boy who liked baseball maybe, who had a girl back home who was scared and cold and a long way from the fields he knew. That's what we did with those tags. We didn't collect them as trophies. That's a myth, a terrible one. For us, they were a covenant. A promise to the fallen that they wouldn't be forgotten. A promise to the families that they would get an answer, as painful as it was. Every tag I sent back was a piece of my own heart going with it. You see, you start out thinking you're just saving lives. But you learn that sometimes saving a name is all the salvation you have to offer. And in a world gone mad, that small, simple act of remembering, that was the one thing that kept me human. It was my silent promise, whispered over and over again on 1,000 bloody fields, to every David Miller I ever met. I remember you. I remember you all. The first time you freeze. It's not like in the movies where everything is clean and quick. It's messy. The air is thick with the smell of cordite and wet earth and something else, something sweet and metallic that you don't want to name. You're pulling back, the order is to retreat. A scattered, chaotic dash from one shell hole to the next, and there he is. Not a soldier, not an enemy, just a kid, younger than me, and I was just a kid myself. He's lying half in a ditch, his uniform sodden with mud and something darker. The fighting has moved past us. The machine gun fire is a distant chatter, but the whine of artillery is constant, a ghost in the sky. My buddy, Klaus, he's already past me. He shouts my name. Erich, move your ass. But my feet are rooted. This one looked like he was sleeping, except for the way his head was tilted back, his mouth open to the rain. And around his neck on a grimy cord were his tags. Our orders were clear. If you find one, if it's safe, you take them. Intelligence, they said. Confirmation. So I knelt down, the mud sucking at my knees, and I fumbled with the cord. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the knot loose. His skin was cold, waxy. I finally got them off, and the metal felt alien in my hand, a tiny, cold weight that held an entire life. I shoved them in my pocket and ran, my heart hammering against my ribs like it wanted out. For days after I could feel them in my pocket, a guilty secret. I'd take them out and look at the name stamped into the metal, a string of letters that meant nothing and everything. Ivan Petrov. I wondered if he had a girl back home, if his mother knew. That was the first time. It felt like a violation, a theft of the last thing he owned. But war has a way of grinding down your sensitivities. After the 10th time, or maybe the 20th, you lose count. It becomes something else. It becomes a habit, like cleaning your rifle or digging a foxhole. The horror gets buried under layers of sheer necessity. You're not a soldier anymore. You're a scavenger, a machine. The battlefield after a fight is a terrible marketplace, and you're there to pick it clean. You stop seeing a person. You see a body. You see a source of ammunition, maybe a good pair of boots if yours are falling apart, a half-eaten ration if you're desperate. And you see the dog tags. It becomes a routine, a drill you could do in your sleep. Roll the body over if you have to. Check the pockets for any papers, a map, anything. Then the tags. Snap the cord or slide it off over the head. The cold touch of the metal becomes familiar, a part of the landscape. You don't read the name. You just register it as an object, a thing to be collected, and you drop it into the small leather pouch you carry specifically for this purpose. The clink of them hitting the others is a sound you get used to. It's the sound of a job done. It's the sound of staying alive because the officers want their numbers, and keeping the officers happy is part of staying alive. They told us it was for intelligence, and maybe somewhere, in some warm, dry headquarters far from the front, it was. They could track unit movements, confirm casualties, all that grand strategy stuff that meant less than nothing to us in the mud. For us, the grunts, the lancer, those tags took on another life. They became a currency. There was a grim barter system that emerged in the shadows of the war. I remember once, our company commander, Hauptmann Weber, was a real piece of work, a Ririchellen type who got his position through party connections. He loved to boast about our confirmed kills to the battalion staff. He'd hound us for tags, especially after a skirmish where we'd been on the defensive, where the numbers were low. He wanted his tally, so a trade was brokered. A couple of the older guys who'd been in it since Poland, they'd approach you. "Hey, kid, you got any extra tickets?" That's what we called them sometimes, dark humor being the only kind we had. Train tickets home. If you had a few tags from a previous engagement, you could trade them. For a pack of cigarettes, real ones, not the awful ersatz stuff that tasted like burning leaves. Or for a night off from a punishing fatigue duty. Once, I traded 2 tags for a small, warm loaf of black bread that a cook had squirreled away. You stood there, haggling over these little pieces of metal that represented a dead man, and you felt hollow, but your stomach was emptier than your soul, so you did it. Turning in a handful of tags to the clerk was the strangest feeling. You'd empty your pouch onto his desk, and he'd count them, his finger tapping each one. 7, confirmed. He'd make a note in a ledger, and that was it. The sum total of a life, reduced to a tick mark in a book. All the dreams, the fears, the love that Ivan Petrov or John Smith had ever known, gone, just a number on a report. Their humanity was stripped away, and in the process, a little piece of your own was stripped away too. To survive that, you have to build a wall inside your head, a thick stone wall between you and what you're doing. I made a conscious decision, after a particularly bad stretch outside Kharkov, to stop reading the names. I would look at the tags, but I wouldn't let the letters form words in my mind. I'd see a J, a K, a string of numbers, and that's all they were, just markings, like part numbers on a piece of machinery. Because that's what we were all becoming, just broken machinery on the vast, bloody factory floor of the Eastern Front. You had to. If you let yourself think, this was Sergei, he liked to sing, he was afraid of dogs, you go mad. So you build the wall brick by brick. The dark jokes were the mortar that held it together. My friend Hans, he was a carpenter from Hamburg. He had a wife and a new baby girl he'd never seen. He'd hold up a pair of tags and say, "Well, this one's heading east, boys." All the way to Berlin for processing. And we'd laugh, a dry, hollow laugh that didn't reach our eyes. It was the only way. The numbness wasn't a choice. It was a defense mechanism. It was the only way to wake up and put on your frozen boots and step out into another day of hell without just putting your rifle under your chin and ending it. You became a ghost in your own body, going through the motions, feeling nothing. The war became a grey fog, and the tags were just shadows in the mist. But walls crack. They always do. For me, it was outside a burned-out village. The name doesn't matter anymore, they all blur together. It was spring, and the snow was melting, turning the world into a sea of mud that clung to everything. We were mopping up, moving through what was left of the place. I saw a soldier, one of theirs, slumped against the wall of a shattered cottage. He'd been there a while. The process was automatic by then. Check for papers. Nothing. Then the tags. I reached for the cord, and as I pulled, the tags snagged on something. There was a small, folded photograph tucked behind them, pressed against his chest. I pulled it out. The paper was damp, but the image was clear. A young woman smiling, her hair in a style you didn't see back home. And on her lap, a little boy, maybe 2 years old, with serious eyes and a toy wooden truck held tight in his hands. They were sitting on a step somewhere, in a patch of sunlight. A simple, perfect moment. And in that second, the wall I'd spent 2 years building, brick by careful brick, just shattered. It didn't crumble, it exploded. It wasn't a dead soldier anymore. It was a man. A man who got letters from this woman, who probably carried this same photo in his pocket, who looked at it at night, missing the weight of his son on his lap. He had a life exactly like the one I dreamed of, the one I fought to get back to. I thought of the photo of my own Honor I carried, tucked into my pay book, her smile my only comfort. And I saw this man, not as an enemy, not as a statistic, but as a father, a husband, a son. Someone who just wanted to go home. The weight of it hit me like a physical blow. I stumbled back and sat down hard in the mud, the photograph trembling in my hand. The clatter of the tags as I dropped them sounded obscenely loud. Hands found me like that a few minutes later. He didn't say anything. He just looked at my face, at the photo in my hand, and he understood. He gently took the tags from the ground and the photograph from me, and he tucked the picture back behind the tags, and he put them both in his own pouch. "Come on, Erich," he said softly. "We have to keep moving." But I couldn't move. The grey fog had lifted, and the war was suddenly, terrifyingly vivid in all its brutal, personal horror. Every color was too bright, every sound too sharp. The burden I carried, which I'd thought was just my pack and my rifle, suddenly felt 1,000 times heavier. From that day on, I could never fully rebuild the wall. The numbness was gone. Every time I had to perform that grim task after that, it was different. I saw the chipped tooth on the boy from Siberia. I saw the homemade stitch in the jacket of the man from Moscow. I saw the life that was extinguished. The war became a heavier burden because I was feeling it again, really feeling it. The tags were no longer just metal. They were grave markers I carried in my pocket. The dark jokes stuck in my throat. The hunger and the fear were the same, but now there was a new layer, a deep, aching sorrow for all of it. For them, for us, for the whole damned, stupid waste of it all. It was the price of remembering that we were all just men, far from home, doing things no man should ever have to do. And when I finally made it home, when I held my Honor in my arms for the first time in 6 years, I thought of that other photograph, of that other woman waiting for a man who would never come home. And I knew that the weight of those little pieces of metal, the ghosts of all those names I tried not to read, would be a burden I would carry for the rest of my life. You never forget the silence. After the artillery stops, after the last machine gun coughs and goes quiet, that's when it really gets to you. Your ears are ringing so bad it's like someone stuck a church bell in your head. But underneath that, there's nothing. A void. The world just stops breathing. The air is thick with this chalky dust from pulverized brick and stone, and it smells, God. It smells like cordite and burnt meat, and things I don't even want to name. You're moving forward then, your legs feeling like wood, your heart hammering against your ribs like it wants out, and you're stepping over ground where both sides fell. It ain't a battlefield anymore, not really. It's a landscape of the dead. You see them tangled together sometimes, a Jerry and one of our boys, locked in a final embrace that wasn't about friendship. And there's this unspoken thing that passes between us, the guys still standing. You'd see a man look at a fallen enemy, and there'd be a flicker in his eyes, a little nod, just a second where we were all the same. Just men, surrounded by the cost. There was no order for it, no sergeant telling us to be respectful. It just happened. It was a truce we made with ourselves, I guess, to hang on to a shred of the men we used to be before all this started. I remember one time, we pushed into this little cluster of houses that had been giving us hell for what felt like days. A single machine gun nest, a MG-42 they called a Hitler's buzzsaw, had pinned us down in a ditch for hours. That sound. It's like ripping canvas, only 1,000 times faster, and it chills your blood. When we finally got up there, after we tossed a couple grenades through the window, the silence came back. We went in, rifles ready, fingers tense on the triggers, but there was no need. The crew was just there. 3 of them lying where our grenades had found them. There was no triumph in that moment, none of that Hollywood nonsense. Just this heavy, bone-deep exhaustion. My buddy Mike, a big guy from Chicago. He just stared at them. Then he walked over to one, an officer by the look of his uniform, and he didn't say a word. He took his own ground sheet, the one he slept under, and he laid it over the officer's body. It was the damnedest thing. This guy had been trying to kill us not 10 minutes ago, and now Mike was giving him a dignity in death. Then, and only then, did he gently lift the man's tunic, take his paybook and his disc, his dog tags. It wasn't about loot, it was procedure information. But the covering him up first, that was something else. That was humanity screaming to be heard over all the madness. Those tags, they weren't just pieces of metal. You held them in your hand and they were warm, still holding the heat of the life that had just left. You'd look at the name stamped on it, the number, and you'd wonder, was he a farmer, a school teacher? Did he have a girl back home waiting for a letter that would never come? It made him a person, not just a target. And that was a dangerous thought to have, but it was an honest one. Sometimes, on the rare occasions when the fighting would just stop, like two boxers too tired to throw another punch, a temporary truce would be called. It was always an uneasy thing, standing out in Naaman's land with the other side doing the same, everyone's weapons lowered, but everyone's eyes wary. We'd be there to get our boys, to bring them back for a proper burial if we could. And you'd see the German soldiers doing the same, their faces hollowed out with the same grief, the same fatigue that we felt. They moved slow, like old men, bending down to lift their comrades. And in those moments, you saw it. You saw that they were just as scared, just as tired, just as sick of the whole damned thing as we were. When we buried a man, whether he was ours or theirs when the situation called for it, we tried to do it right. You dig the grave deep enough, say a few words if you knew any, if your voice would hold. And I remember one time we'd buried a German soldier we'd found in a shell crater. He was young, maybe younger than me. Before we filled the grave, the lieutenant placed the man's dog tags right on his chest, over his heart. He said it was so if anyone ever came looking, they'd know for sure who it was. But it felt like more than that. It felt like a gesture, like we were saying, "We see you. You were a man and you fought, and now it's over for you. Rest." It was a respect for the soldier, not the enemy. Because when you went through their pockets, not for souvenirs, but for intelligence, you'd find the same things we carried. The crinkled letters from home, the fading photographs of a sweetheart or a mother holding a baby, a little good luck charm some kid's sister had made. I saw one guy with a St. Christopher medal, just like the one my own mother had pressed into my hand the day I shipped out. That hits you. It hits you right in the gut. This fella praying to his saint for protection, same as me, while we tried to kill each other. It's a crazy, mix-it-up world. That's the thing they never tell you about. It ain't the big battles, the strategies on a map that stick with you. It's the small, quiet things that happen in between the explosions. It's the taste of cold coffee from your canteen, the way a cigarette tasted better than any meal when you were scared out of your wits. It's the sound of a buddy snoring in the foxhole next to you, a sound that meant you weren't alone. It's the dark humor, the jokes you'd make that weren't really funny, but you'd laugh anyway because the alternative was to scream. We'd call a near miss from a shell a close shave, or say someone who was really lucky had a rabbit's foot up his ass. It was how we kept from going insane. And the homesickness, that was a physical ache. You'd lie there at night, staring up at the same stars that were shining over your hometown, and you'd wonder if you'd ever see your porch light again, ever smell your ma's cooking, ever hold your girl's hand. You de-trade all the glory in the world for one boring afternoon back home, just sitting on the stoop, doing nothing at all. That's what you fought for, really. Not for flags or politics, but for the chance to get back to that. To be a person again, not just a soldier. I think about those German boys often. I wonder if any of them made it through, if they got to go home and have a life. I hope so. In those brief moments of truce, in those acts of respect for the dead, we acknowledged something important. We acknowledged that the real enemy wasn't the man in the other uniform. The real enemy was the war itself. It was the machine that chewed us all up and spat us out. And those little gestures, covering a body with a ground sheet, placing the tags on a chest, they were our way of fighting back against that machine. They were the only things that kept our own souls from being buried in the mud along with the fallen. It was a fragile thing, that humanity, but my God, it was everything. It was the difference between coming home a man and not coming home at all. This tin of coffee smells like heaven, the real stuff, not the burnt barley garbage we drank for years. It lets you forget for a minute, you know. But some things, the smell of this coffee can't wash away. They're like the grit under your fingernails that never comes out, no matter how hard you scrub. People ask me about the war, and they want the big stuff, the battles, the names of towns they've heard of. But the war for me, the part that stuck, wasn't the thunder of the 88s or the scream of the Stukas. It was the silence. The silence in my pocket where the dog tags rested. Not ours, the enemy. S. And later my own men's. That was my war. The lieutenant's heavy burden, they'd call it in some book. To me it was just a weight that cracked something inside me, a hairline fracture in my soul that never healed. It started as paperwork, can you believe that? Pure bureaucracy. The German war machine needed its receipts. For every bullet spent, a form. For every kilometer advanced, a map overlay. And for every enemy soldier killed, a tag, his identity disc. We had to collect them. It was an order, crisp and clear, like everything from high command, who were sipping coffee in Paris or Warsaw, far from the mud and the stink. At first it was just a task, a grim chore after a firefight. You'd move through the quiet that was louder than the battle, the air still thick with cordite and dust, and you'd do it. You'd roll the body over if it was in one piece, trying not to look at the face, because a face is a person, and you couldn't think of them as people. You'd fumble for the cold metal chain, slick sometimes with things I don't like to name, and you'd snap it or pull it over a head that would loll in a way the living never allow. Then you'd drop it into a canvas bag. Clink. Another one. The bag would get heavier with each one, a grotesque shopping trip where the price was your own humanity. I carried that bag back to my command post, a dugout in a forest or a bombed-out farmhouse, and the weight wasn't just physical. It was the weight of all those lives, ended, and now I was the accountant of the dead. The forms were the worst part of that duty. I'd sit at a wobbly table, a captured Allied blanket thrown over it to make it seem less crude, and I'd fill out the paperwork. Name, rank, serial number. The cold, bureaucratic language. Fallen enemy combatant, location grid reference 48B6, unit identified as. How do you capture the horror of a boy with his chest torn open by shrapnel on a form? How do you describe the sound he might have made, or the way the flies were already gathering in a neat little box on a piece of paper? You can't. The war machine didn't want that story. It just wanted the data. It turned men into statistics, and I was the adding machine. My fingers would be stained with ink and dirt, and I'd stare at the tags, these simple pieces of metal with raised letters. Ivan Petrov, 58,742, just a number, but that number had a mother. He had a life before some fool politician sent him charging towards my machine gun nest. He probably loved vodka and singing those sad Russian songs we could sometimes hear at night across Narmansland. He might have had a girl waiting for him in some village I'd never see. And I was reducing him to a line on a triplicate form that would be filed away in some archive in Berlin, forgotten. That's the coldness of it, the utter, chilling efficiency that makes you feel less than human. Then there was the other side of the coin, the intelligence game. Command was desperate for information. Where was the enemy? How many were there? Were they fresh troops or battered remnants? Those little tags were like pieces of a puzzle. You get a handful from a skirmish, and you try to piece it together. This serial number prefix is from a division we thought was 100 kilometers north. What are they doing here? This name sounds Ukrainian. Maybe it's one of those Ost battalions. Their morale might be low. You'd write it up, send it back, and some sharp-faced major would nod, pleased. Good work, Lieutenant. This confirms the shift in their defensive line. And you'd feel a twist in your gut, because that confirmation came from the bodies of men we had just killed. We were using the last physical evidence of their existence to kill more of their comrades. It was a necessary evil, they told us, for the fatherland. But in the quiet of the night, it just felt evil. It felt like we were grave robbers, stealing not just from the dead, but from their memory, turning their very identities into weapons. There was no honor in it, none of the glory they talked about in the propaganda films. It was just a dirty, grimy business. But all of that, the paperwork, the intelligence, that was the official weight. The real burden, the one that sits on my chest even now, 60 years later, was the letters. Writing to the families of my own men. That was my duty, too. I dreaded it more than a Soviet artillery barrage. At least with artillery, it's loud and fast, and you can try to hide. With the letters, there was no hiding. I'd have to sit down with my fountain pen and a sheet of the best paper I could scavenge, and I'd have to find words. What words are there? Dear Frau Schmidt, your son Hans was a brave soldier who died for Germany in a heroic action near Kursk. Heroic action. It was a muddy ditch where a sniper's bullet caught him in the throat as he was heating up a can of soup. He died choking on his own blood, clutching a photograph of his girl, Elsa. I saw it happen. How do you put that in a letter? The words felt like lies, hollow and inadequate. They were just empty phrases I was tossing into an abyss of grief that I could never hope to fill. I could almost feel the paper trembling in the mother's hand 1,000 miles away, see the tear falling on the ink, smudging the word heroic. I wasn't giving them comfort. I was just making the notification official. I was the bearer of the worst news a family can get. And every time I handled an enemy dog tag, I'd think of him. The other lieutenant, the Russian one, or the American, or the Brit. Somewhere in his own command post, he was sitting down with his own piece of paper, his own fountain pen. He was staring at a name on a tag, trying to find words for a family he would never know. He was feeling that same dread, that same crushing responsibility. Was he a family man himself? Did he have a little girl waiting for him? In that moment, we were the same. The uniform, the flag, the politics, it all fell away. We were just two young men, trapped in the same nightmare, connected by this terrible fellowship of grief. We were the ones who had to send the boys under our command to die, and then write the letters explaining the unexplainable. I never met that man, but I felt a bond with him, a shared burden that transcended all the hatred they drilled into us. We were brothers in a fraternity no one would ever want to join. Which brings me to the box. I had a small wooden ammo crate, the kind that held rifle cartridges. I emptied it out, and it became something else. It became a box of ghosts. That's where I kept the tags of my own fallen men, my boys, until I could make it back to Battalion HQ to hand them over to the clerk for permanent processing. I couldn't just toss them in a bag with the enemy tags. That felt like a betrayal. So they went in the box. At first, it was almost empty, just a few tags rattling around in the bottom. But as the weeks turned into months, as we fought our way through the endless plains of Russia, the box got heavier. Each tag that went in was a failure, a personal failure. Fritz Weber, the joker who could make you laugh even when your boots were frozen solid. Gone at a river crossing. Karl Haider, the quiet kid from Bavaria who played the harmonica at night, a sound more beautiful than any military band. Silenced by a mortar. Each one was a face, a laugh, a story, a life I was responsible for. I was their officer. I was supposed to bring them through this, to lead them to victory, or at least to keep them alive. And I had failed. Every tag in that box was a verdict against me. I'd open that box sometimes just to look at them, and the cold metal would feel hot in my hand. I could hear their voices. I could see them smoking their last cigarette. That box was the heaviest thing I carried, heavier than any weapon, any pack. It was the weight of my own conscience. The grimmest ritual of all was emptying the box, making the trip back to the rear, to the relative safety of the battalion command post, where there were proper roofs and sometimes even hot food. The clerk, a pale man who always had clean fingernails, would open his ledger. "How many, Lieutenant?" he'd ask, his tone as neutral as if he were asking about the weather. I'd pour the tags onto his table. Clink, clink, clink. A little pile of metal that represented a platoon's worth of grief. He'd count them, check them off his list, and sweep them into a drawer, and my box would be empty. For a few days, maybe a week, it would be light. Carrying that empty box back to the front felt like a strange kind of hope, a desperate, foolish prayer. Maybe this time it would stay empty. Maybe we'd have a quiet sector. Maybe the war would end. But it was a hope that was never, ever fulfilled. The box would always fill up again. The ghosts would always return. By the end, the wood of that box was stained dark, and not from the outside. The war ground on, and we got worn down, thinner, more hollowed out inside. The dark humor that kept us going dried up. The mail from home became less frequent, the news more worrying. We weren't the confident soldiers of 1941 anymore. We were just tired men, trying to survive another day, haunted by the clinking sound in our pockets and the empty faces of the boys we'd lost. I remember one time, it was during the retreat, the long, painful slog back west. It was chaos. We were scattered, mixed in with other units. I was separated from my men for 2 days, hiding in a barn with a couple of strangers from a Waffen SS unit, hard men with dead eyes. I thought I'd lost everything. But when I finally found what was left of my company, the first thing my sergeant, an old veteran named Gunther who had been a cobbler in Cologne, said to me was, "Thank God you're alive, sir." He simply pointed to a rucksack leaned against a tree. "I kept it safe for you, Herr Lieutenant," he said. It was the box. He'd carried it through the chaos. He knew what it meant. That box, that damn box of ghosts, was more important than any strategic map or weapon. It was the only thing we had left of the men who were gone. It was our duty to them to see that they were accounted for, that they weren't just left to rot in some forgotten field in Russia. That moment with Gunther, that was the war, too. The loyalty, the quiet understanding between men who have seen too much. It wasn't all horror. There was a bond there, forged in fire and loss, that was stronger than anything I've known since. The war ended for me in a field hospital. I never got to empty the box for the last time. I often wonder what happened to it. Did the clerk in Berlin finally close the ledger? Did those tags ever make it back to the families? Or are they still in some warehouse, a pile of forgotten metal, the last physical evidence of boys who never came home? I kept one, just one. It's not mine, and it's not an enemy. It belongs to a boy named Friedrich who had no family. He told me once he was an orphan. When he died, there was no one to write to, so I kept his tag. I don't know why. Maybe so someone somewhere would remember that he existed, that he was here, that he mattered. When I hold it now, it's smooth from years of handling. It's cold, but it feels alive with memory. It's my confession and my penance. It's the weight I choose to carry. Because forgetting them, that would be the final betrayal. So I remember the weight. The cold, heavy clink of a life reduced to a tag in my pocket, a line on a form, a ghost in a box. That's the sound the war left me with. Not the sirens or the shells, just the quiet, metallic sound of a burden that never gets any lighter.